Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. If you enjoy what you see here today, remember to like and subscribe to the channel and check out the Patreon page in the description below the video if you want to learn more about sculpture. Enjoy the video. Let's tackle the final problem our sculpture confronts us with here, and that is of course the iris and the pupil. Now, we already had design present in our sculpture, a design I often use, and I find that this design works really well most of the time. That design is simple, of course. It's just a dug out iris and pupil combined into one concave shape. There is a lot you can do with this shape actually. You can control the depth of the concavity, and this helps allude to the eye color through value. The position of the head can also be taken into account when choosing a depth, as the two must function well together. You can alter the shape of the concavity to control how light reflects out from the inside of the eye and therefore alter the look of the iris and pupil itself. You can also control the edge between the white of the eye and the iris and pupil to alter the look and feel of the eye. This type of edge control would alter how intense the eye feels essentially. Yet with all of those possible attributes to manipulate, I chose not to stick with this design this time. The reason is that it's a design I've used countless times over and over in most of my work. This piece is small, but it's an eye that's twice life size, so the eye itself is rather large compared to regular people's eyes, which is what I sculpt most of the time. I also wanted to do something different with eyes for once. I've done the same thing so many times, and it gets a bit predictable and boring, frankly. Eyes and hair are some of the areas where I feel there is real room for improvement on my part. Well, in all areas there are room for improvement, certainly, but with eyes and hair, the room is larger, let's say. So with that in mind, I decided to go for a different design for iris and pupil this time around, and the one I chose to draw my inspiration from is this one. This sculpture, which I don't know the name of, is from one of the monumental cemeteries in Italy, probably the one in Geneva or Milan. These cemeteries are exceptional and filled to the brim with 18th and 19th century representational sculpture at the highest level. This period is one of the high watermarks for realist sculpture, where the techniques and quality of work is borderline unmatched. And the quantity of good work is also unmatched, I'd say, compared to any other period in art history. However, it's not my favorite period probably, since I tend to prefer the more idealized and slightly stylized work of the Renaissance and the Baroque. But there's plenty of inspiration to be taken from these cemeteries, no matter what style you intend your work to be in. This sculpture has the iris slightly recessed deeper compared to the white of the eye. The pupil itself is then dug even deeper to create a two-tone effect, and there is a little triangle shape inside the bottom of the pupil, sitting at a slight angle, leaning backwards into the pupil to catch the light, if we imagine the light being from above, which is most usually going to be. A similar effect is something that I'll try to recreate in this sculpture. I think this is an appropriate decision, since the model has lighter blue eyes. It can very often be a good idea to determine what a good design choice would be by comparing the effect to what you see on your reference. So essentially, look at the inspiration and look at the reference and see if they sort of align. Lighter eyes, like blue eyes, need a design inside the eye that captures the lightness of value that blue eyes have. And the same thing, or the opposite thing, is of course true for darker brown eyes. We need an effect that creates a darker value inside the eye to capture the visual impression of the eye of the model. So look at your reference and let that guide the decision on the design of the eye. If you've gotten this far into the video and you're one of the people not subscribed to the channel, do yourself and me a favor and hit that subscribe button and the bell to turn on notifications on when new videos come out. I'd really appreciate the support. And you can also check out my Patreon page if you're interested in learning more about sculpture. There's a link in the description below. Since the eye itself, especially the iris and pupil, cannot be sculpted as they are without appearing nothing like they do in real life, we need to create a design that deviates from reality yet captures the look of reality. This occurs in hair as well, as we discussed above. You're sculpting for the effect and not to represent. There are many places where such a choice would potentially be appropriate, and it's up to the individual artist to decide where they sculpt for representation and where they sculpt for effect. Hair is one where I'd say there is no choice unless you create a wig for your sculpture to wear. Clay can never really represent hair, only create the effect of hair. A lot of sculptors will deal with fingernails and other details in the same way. They won't sculpt them, but they'll try to allude to them by sculpting an effect. I tend to prefer to sculpt for representation over effect in most places, but in some places I don't find there to be much of a choice. The eyes, if sculpted for representation, for example, start appearing like someone is blind, so for eyes, as well as for hair, I sculpt for effect. The actual sculpting taking place, while difficult because it's small, is actually not that complicated. I'm creating a second sphere here that's recessed inside the white of the eye. This sphere represents the iris and it's recessed so that it appears to be at a different value than the sclera, which is the white of the eye. Since the white of the eye is of a lighter value than the iris, having the iris sink a bit in makes sense. If we reversed this relationship and had the iris stick out in front of the sclera, which is of course what happens in reality, the sclera would look darker and the iris and our sculpture would appear blind. I probably ended up sinking the iris in a bit too much here, creating an effect that's a bit too intense. If you're going to be using this design, you should pay careful attention to the depth at which the iris sits in relationship to the sclera. Make sure it's subtle and not as much as I'm doing here. Otherwise you can get an eye that looks a little too intense in my opinion. While sculpting the entire eyeball in the last episode, I built the entire sphere and then dug out the iris. Here I'm going to simply build the sphere of the iris and build the opening for the pupil right into it from the get-go. There's no particular reasoning for this. I just sort of decided to do it this way this time, and a lot of times, decisions like this are a bit random. I just do whatever I feel like in the moment. For smaller things like this, I don't think it matters too much. I try my best to center the pupil inside the iris and follow the reference for proportion. The size of the pupil is going to change the nature of the eye quite drastically, of course. The two features I'd say we have to play with in terms of emotion when it comes to eyes is how open the eyelids are. That's of course been settled already. And the second is going to be the size of the pupil. As we all know, the pupil can dilate and change size to alter the amount of light getting into our eyes. Extra small or extra large pupils are going to change the look of the sculpture and give it a different feeling. I'm not looking for anything specific here, so I simply go for what I see on my reference, which seems to be a fairly relaxed model in a decently well lit and comfortable environment. The little triangle protruding up from the bottom of the iris into the pupil is added and it's sculpted at an angle leaning back to capture an extra bit of light, sort of mimicking the glint or wetness of the eye itself. This is of course an optical illusion, and sadly I'm not so sure that this particular version worked so well for me. It's probably the sculptor and not the design's fault in this instance. Controlling the shape and size of this little triangle is of course vital. How does it blend into the interior of the pupil itself? These are questions that we have to answer. So a few key takeaways here. Be subtle when sculpting the eyes, especially if the pose is more natural and not in need of extremely attentive eyes, like if the pose is full of action, let's say. Subtle almost always works better, and the fact that the eyes are the eyes will draw our attention to them anyways. Don't overly rely on sharp edges in the eyes to make people look there. You can easily go too far and create what is a strange looking eye. Also, pay attention to the pose of your reference. While I'm not sure about this, I do think that the position of the iris and pupil inside the eye where the eye is looking, might impact what design works best for the eye. My design inspiration has his head tilted forwards and therefore the eye sort of looking up and in front. But my sculpture is just looking straight ahead, not with her head tilted forward. So maybe the combination of this design and the position of my eye was not the best choice after all. Though I can't verify this 100%. Thank you for watching all the way till the end. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. And if you want to learn more, check out my Patreon, where you can get instant access to over 50 hours of in-depth videos on all things sculpture. Thank you for watching, and stay creative.